Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. Well, it's great to join you this morning, or is it still morning for you guys? Might be nearly about ready to tick over to afternoon. And hopefully it's been a really good morning session for you. I'm joining you from Larrakia country here in Darwin, and like John mentioned, most of our work is out in Arnhem Land with Yolngu communities. Most of our staff, about 80% of our staff are Yolngu, which gives us just a really rich cross-cultural, cross-linguistic environment that sort of is the everyday, day-to-day of our work. I wanted to kind of hone in on just a couple issues with you guys in terms of some cross-cultural legal education frameworks, or just community education, community engagement frameworks generally. The thing that I wanted to start off with was just giving a perspective on how different people can have different perceptions of the same thing. And I think if we don't sort of appreciate and understand just how easily it is to look at the same thing, hear the same story, talk about the, talk about the same type of content, and yet walk away or come at it with completely different perceptions, then any type of cross-cultural, cross-linguistic CLE work is going to be very, very limited. Now, obviously, you know, from our point of view as linguists, as a language centre, through the type of community education work we do, best practice is always people's first language, putting things into first language. But that's not the whole story. There are other parts to good community engagement, particularly when you're coming from dominant culture to non-dominant culture, that also go beyond language and communication. So I'm hoping to sort of unpack some of that today. But I wanted to start off with, I guess, that idea of just how different perceptions can be. Now, I'll start with a couple of visual things, and then we'll move on to some more of the language things. Is the screen there big enough that if I put something up on the screen, you guys can all see it reasonably well?
Yeah, that's fine. We can all see.
Okay. Great. So first one up here, can you all see the blue and yellow screen? Okay, so first question.
You're not sharing full screen, you don't share your...
Sorry, what's that, John?
You're not showing your full screen, you're sharing your editing screen.
Yeah.
There we go. You able to see that? Yeah. All right, so give me a hands up. Are the yellow dots moving or are they still? So hands up if they're moving. Okay, great. So I think that's most of you. Now, I want you to focus in on any one yellow dot and look at it, and then tell me if the yellow dots are moving or still. So focus in on one dot and then hands up if it's moving for you. Okay, so somehow it all went from moving to not moving. All right, well, it's exactly the same picture. There's no magic there. And objectively, if we want to use that word, which I'm always hesitant to use, none of the dots are actually moving. It was just your brain telling you that they were moving as your eyes were going across them. Let's have a look at this one. We've got two pictures here, same picture or different picture? So hands up if they look different to you, the picture on the left versus the one on the right. Yep, okay. Different, so maybe I could ask that question more clearly. Is the picture taken from the same angle or different angle? So hands up if it's a different angle for you. Okay, so interesting. Most people looks like putting hands up. Now, interestingly, if we measured all of the corners, it's the identical picture. There's no difference between those two pictures. It's just the contrast between the way that they're sitting next to each other, that they look like they're on different angles, but they're completely the same picture. Now, let's jump a little bit more to kind of a language point of view. I'll just stop sharing screens for the moment so you can makes it easier for me to see you when I don't share the screen. So from a language point of view, there are so many examples we could talk about how different groups can hear or look at or see the same type of message and come away with different perceptions, different understandings of that. Probably one of the most obvious ones are at the word level, where words have different meanings, particularly in the context of Aboriginal English versus Standard English. One that's pretty Australia-wide is, say, the use of the word deadly, which probably most of you are familiar with in Queensland, as well as, commonly used word here in the Territory. Now, despite how well known the use of deadly is in an Aboriginal English context, that didn't stop the NT government from running a public health campaign, Smoking is Deadly. So, think about how effective that would be from a community messaging point of view. We've had some other great ones around, post-intervention. There was all the messaging from federal government around closing the gap. I was doing a lot of work in Alice Springs with the Aboriginal Interpreter Service, and most of our staff were quite concerned, saying, why are they wanting to close the gap? Now, is there anybody who's familiar with Alice Springs who would be able to predict why that might cause people concerns?
No.
Yeah, so the gap is the main thoroughfare that separates two halves of the community. And people are saying, why are they closing the gap? We have family on the other side, and we still need to visit our family. And so, same sentence, two very, very different responses. Now, another one that is, again, still at the word level, but perhaps, funny but not as funny, is a lot of Aboriginal languages don't distinguish between can and will. So in the traditional Aboriginal languages, that's one range of meanings. And so when you're doing public messaging for people who speak an Aboriginal language as their first language, anytime you use the word can, you need to ask yourself, if I replace this with the word will, does it significantly change the meaning? And if it does, that's a red flag for you. So I was talking to some health workers down in South Australia about this, and we were going through a whole bunch of different red flags that they needed to be aware of. And a couple of the health workers looked at each other, turned slightly white or a whiter shade of white, and said, oh, that explains things. And I said, all right, fess up, what did you do? And a couple of years before that, they had run a vaccination campaign around 5 communities in the APY lands, giving vaccinations to teenagers, young adults. And on the way out, as people were leaving after the vaccination, they gave people a piece of paper that said, you cannot get pregnant for 12 months after this injection. So what's the predictable miscommunication between you cannot get pregnant and you will not get pregnant? Very, very different takeaway messages. And of course, there was a spate of unplanned pregnancies across those communities because people walked away with the view that they had just been given a contraceptive. And that's purely through poor choice of wording at the word level. All of these are things that from a linguistic point of view are very, very predictable in terms of the miscommunication that arises. Now, it's not just at the word level, though. We can jump up to how stories are told. I've shared this story probably with some of you before, but I think it's a great illustration of how people from different cultural backgrounds can look at the same thing and walk away with a completely different perspective on it. And so this was some research that was done in Perth back in 2010, commissioned by Department of Education. There were a lot of Aboriginal primary school children who were Aboriginal English as their first language, but scoring very poorly on all of the standardized tests for English. And so they asked some linguists to come in and try and see if they could understand part of what was happening. And so one of the things that the linguists did, very sort of basic but effective linguistic research, was just to ask people to tell in their own words what they were hearing and what they were seeing. So what they did is they had the teachers read the different stories that were part of the curriculum and then individually ask students to retell the story back to the teacher with the researcher sitting there. So there are 100 non-Aboriginal students, 100 Aboriginal students. One of the books they read was called Rosie John Brown and the Midnight Cat. I don't know if any of you who have kids may have read that story, but basically the story goes, there was an old lady who lived alone in a cottage in a forest in the woods. She lived with her dog. And they sat by the fire inside the cottage. They were happy together. One day, a black midnight cat appeared outside the cottage. It wanted to come in, but John Brown, the dog, didn't want to let the cat in. The cat kept trying to come in. John Brown kept stopping the cat from coming in. After a while, the old lady got sad, and John Brown decided to let the cat in. The cat came in and helped to cheer up the old lady. So when they asked students to tell back that story, the non-Aboriginal primary school students consistently had a similar story with some details missing, but the actual narrative itself wasn't significantly changed. When the Aboriginal primary school students were asked to tell back that story, very consistently, the initial response was something along the lines of, "That's a really bad story. Why did you tell us that story?" And so then the researchers would say, "Well, you know, what do you mean it's a bad story?" And the students would say, "Well, that old lady, she lives alone. What happened to her family?" And so the very first sentence of the story, an old lady living alone, had already put it into a horror genre, because old ladies are not supposed to live alone. They're supposed to have family all around them. So straight away, it's put it into a different genre than it had put it into for the non-Aboriginal students. And so then the students kept telling the story back. Something bad has happened. That old lady, she's run away into the forest. She's hiding in the forest. She's staying inside. She's got the dog to protect her. She's staying by the fire to try and protect herself. That black midnight cat, probably a spirit, maybe the spirit that killed her family, has chased her down and found her in the forest. It keeps trying to get at her. The dog is protecting her, but after a while, the dog's not strong enough. That spirit gets inside. That old lady, she's going to die too. And so you had all these teachers who were blissfully traumatizing their students by reading these stories to them. And that wasn't at the word level or the grammatical level. That was at what we would call linguistically the discourse level in terms of how you construct stories. But same story, two completely different perspectives, two completely different perceptions of what that story was trying to convey, what that story was trying to communicate. I'll give you maybe one other example of that. So I'll do a share screen with you again. All right, and so it's that same type of question. If two people from different language backgrounds were witnessing the same event, would there be significant differences in how they told the story of what they saw? Now, we've got linguistic research from all over the world that consistently shows this. If you play people from different language backgrounds the same video and then ask them to tell back the story, you get surprisingly different variations in terms of how the story comes back to you. So the one that I want to share with you is just a sort of small scale bit of research that we did up here in Arnhem Land, which was around legal issues. And so what we were looking at was from a witness point of view, if somebody was witnessing violence or an altercation, would there be significant differences in how they told the story? And so one of the things we did was we played participants. So individually, half the participants were Anglo-Australian English speakers, the other half of the participants were Yolngu and Yolngu speakers. And one of the videos we played was an excerpt from the New Zealand film Once Were Warriors. And it was that scene in the pub where the main characters, the tough Māori characters, are watching a lady singing, and then another person comes in, turns on a jukebox, interrupts the lady who's singing. So one of the main character, Jake, goes over and effectively says something along the lines of, "Look at your muscles." And then there's a punch up, and the guy who turned on the jukebox gets beaten up pretty badly. And so in asking different people to basically tell back that story, there were a huge number, consistently 10 big differences that came out. But one of the ones that was quite interesting was the way that the Yolngu speakers reconstructed the speech about what had been said. And so I'll give you some examples here. So these were some of the Yolngu participants who were actually creating speech in their retelling that didn't exist at all in the original narrative. So we can see, one of the participants saying "one diramu," which is Yolngu for man, one guy walk up to him, then he tell him to stop doing that, and they was fighting. Another fella walks up and tells him he shouldn't have done that. His mates were listening to the woman singing. Then the fight started. One of them stands up, goes towards him and tells him to stop that music. And so the participants were very comfortable inserting this speech that very clearly never occurred in the original video. And so what do you do with that? And again, if you're thinking a legal context from the point of view of a witness, that could be quite devastating to a witness's credibility if they were creating speech that objectively could be proven that never occurred by reference to the CCT or other materials. But what's going on is that the Yolngu speakers were actually talking about the purpose of the speech. When the person walked over and said, look at those muscles, he wasn't actually talking about muscles. He wasn't talking about, being interested in the guy's weightlifting regime. It was clearly because he wanted him to stop playing the jukebox, and he was upset and offended that the guy had interrupted with the jukebox. And so none of the English speakers did this. The English speakers were all very, in a sense, from a Western English legal point of view, careful to try to stick to, he said something about his muscles without any interpretive framework, whereas the Yolngu speakers just went straight to the purpose and then incorporated the purpose into their retelling of the story. So is it inaccurate? I would say no. It's just they're looking at a different level of the language, a different level of the story, and have reconstructed the actual meaning of the story rather than sticking to surface level details. Another thing that came up interesting from that study, and again consistent with other studies, was just the concept of fighting. And so even from these excerpts that I've got up here, you can see that the fighting was articulated as a mutual event. They was fighting, the fight started, and the vast majority of the story was all about why the fight started, and the specific physical details of the fight were not particularly relevant or important. And in fact, one person told the whole story without even mentioning the fight. It was seen as so irrelevant to the issue of interrupting somebody singing, which was the main focus of the story. And so again, very consistent with this idea that the story from the Yolngu point of view was focused on the underlying social tension. And when people talked about the fight, they were talking about the disruption to the social tension or the disruption to the social harmony. And so then what that meant was when the story was told, the standard English speakers were very, very clear in articulating who started the fight, who threw the first punch, those types of things. Most of the Yolngu speakers never even referred to who started the physical altercation. It was just seen as largely irrelevant. Now, who started the conflict was very, very relevant, but who threw the first punch was not particularly relevant. Now, within our legal framework, who threw the first punch is very relevant from a self-defense point of view, and yet that detail was just generally completely omitted. This then comes up with, the follow-up question, who started the fight? Well, if you're constructing fight as the social conflict, then you're going to answer the question, who started the fight, in a very different way to a person who's answering the question, who started the fight, if you think that fight is limited to the physical altercation. And so you might give two completely different responses. And again, is one objectively correct? Is one objectively wrong? No, it depends on how you construct fight as to who started it. So those are just a few examples. We could go on and on, but just showing how our perceptions to people, particularly when you come from different language backgrounds, can be looking at the same type of event and coming up with a very, very different perspective. So to bring that back to our sort of visual analogy and some of those, the visual illusions. So for this one here, are the dots on the screen all the same color or all different colors? So raise your hand if they're different colors for you. Yeah, okay, so most people raising their hand that they're different colors. Now, again, if we wanted to go from an objective point of view, they're all the same color. The difference is that the colors around them and the colors that are going through them are making our brains think that they're different types of colors. And so we can sort of use this as a bit of an analogy when it comes to this cross-cultural, cross-linguistic perceptions of information. It's the context around the information. It's the experiences that people have had leading up to and before that are going to heavily shape what color they see. And it doesn't mean that one is wrong, one is right. And in fact, I'd very strongly say that we need to get out of thinking about, what's the accurate view of the information, and we need to get into thinking about how does context, how does background experience, how does worldview, how does language impact the ways that people will hear the same stories we're telling, hear the same information that we're telling, look at the same legal education activity, and yet actually see a completely different colour and walk away with a completely different message than what we're thinking. So I'll give you, I guess, two kind of models or ways that you might think about this. This is the first, which I guess would be the more traditional education model that most of us grew up with in schools. And hopefully, all of you kind of are well aware, even from a basic adult education point of view, leaving aside the cross-cultural complexities, that this is a bad model for community education. But the traditional model is that somehow the teacher, the expert, has specialized knowledge, that the students don't yet have that knowledge or those skills. So there's some sort of deficiency or gap or something missing in terms of the student's understanding. And the role of the teacher is to transfer that knowledge and understanding from the teacher's brain into the student's brain. And then often what happens with this type of model, if we implicitly have this type of picture in our mind about what education looks like, is then we put a lot of our efforts into the materials, because we think that, well, if I have better materials, then that's going to help me shift the knowledge from my brain into the student's brain, or that's going to help the students better understand the knowledge that they need to understand. And so then, we sort of can get a little bit distracted by the materials, a little bit distracted by, hopefully this new DVD will solve the problem, this new brochure will solve the problem. And yet, those things in and of themselves are generally fairly ineffective without the other things that we're going to talk about later. So the other issue with this type of model that sort of has, the expert trying to pass on knowledge to the participants is that there's also a really big power imbalance in here, fairly obviously, I think. And if you're working with communities who are already experiencing high rates of being disempowered, being marginalized, being not listened to, then if you go in with an educational model that just reinforces the fact that they don't have any of the answers, they don't have the knowledge, that somehow their knowledge is deficient or lacking or limited, and they need you as the outside expert to come in and help solve their problems. Even if you might successfully convey information on a particular topic, you're actually at risk of contributing to the broader feeling of being disempowered, marginalized, and dependent on the dominant system to make anything happen. And so I think hopefully we all are kind of in agreement that we don't want to be contributing to that sense that it's the dominant culture, it's the outsiders who are coming in who have the solutions, and people from the non-dominant culture have some sort of deficiency or gap that requires the external input to help address those issues or fix that problem. So this is sort of what we grow up with from our days at going to school, and we often unintentionally transfer it into education type of work that we might do even with adults. Now, Freire, he talks quite strongly. This is, one of his quotes that really, I think, hits the nail on the head here, which is, so he says, one cannot expect positive results from an educational or political action program which fails to respect the particular view of the world held by the people. Such a program constitutes cultural invasion, good intentions notwithstanding. And I'll come back to this because I think one of the things that we need to be aware of is the unintended harm that we can create when we're working with communities who are already experiencing senses of powerlessness, loss of agency, and if we're even unintentionally setting ourselves up as the ones who hold the knowledge and have the expertise, we can be creating unintentional harm. So a reflection question at this point in time, from the point of view of cross-cultural CLE work that you might do, is how much of your prep time is spent preparing the content or the materials of what you want to say about the dominant Australian legal system, compared to how much of your prep time is spent understanding participants' experience and worldview. And I would argue that a good target as a starting point is at least 50-50. If your efforts to understand participants' worldview and experience are a tack on, then that should be a red flag for you in terms of your preparation process. But again, I'll come back to how we might actually do this from a program point of view. But that's one. I'm not going to make you fess up an answer. I'm not going to make you, put a percentage time on it. But at a starting point, aim for at least 50-50. As much effort needs to be put into understanding where the participants are coming from, their worldview, their experience about the topic, as you put into thinking, well, how do I teach people about DVOs? How do I teach people about suspended sentences? How do I teach people about voting rights or whatever it is? Because all of those things, people already have a story, people already have experiences, people already have knowledge. So a better model, I suppose, is much more of this sort of cultural iceberg type of model, where we have two worldviews, two cultures, and the role of community education is to build a bridge between those two cultures, between those two worldviews. And there's a couple of things that I would say from this model, and there's a quote that we'll look at in a second that I think illustrates it really nicely. But the first thing is recognizing, acknowledging, and being very upfront about the fact that there are two equal and complete sets of worldviews in operation. And all of the nuance and complexity that we have in Western culture also exists in the cultures and worldviews of groups that we're working with. And this is not about one worldview or one system being lacking or deficient and us filling in the gaps. This is about two systems finding the way to build a bridge between two equal systems. Now, most of you are, again, probably familiar with the cultural iceberg type of picture, which is that, what we see on the surface is really just the tip of the iceberg. The real stuff in terms of, some of those things that are up there on the screen, what does it mean to be friends? What does it mean to be polite? How do you make decisions? How do you express your opinions? What does leadership look like? What does it mean to, when is humor appropriate? How do you use body language? What's logical? What's not logical? All of those things are well below the surface, and yet that's where the real work happens. And yet often our CLE work is sticking up there on much more of the surface level without any attempt to unpack the deeper parts of the iceberg. And so, the bridge is not just a bridge between two systems. The bridge is a bridge that also tries to go below the surface, really tapping into these deeper things. What is fair? What is not fair? What is violence? What is not violence? Because all of those are the things that are going to impact how people will interpret the other information that you might be presenting. And if you don't have a sense of those other interpretive frameworks, then people are very likely to be walking away with a very different message than what you think you're conveying. Now, one sort of tangential comment that I might make here, just where I've touched on, dominant, non-dominant, it's also a framework that's worth thinking about when you're doing community education with migrant groups or groups who've come from overseas, because we often have, I think, a bit of a tendency to paint all migrants from non-English speaking backgrounds with a single brush and not do enough investigation in the sense of that two-way dialogue or understanding of how some of these dominant, non-dominant issues may arise. And so I'll just give one, I guess, example or one thing to look at, which is within other countries, there will be dominant and non-dominant groups themselves. And so if I use examples from Indonesia, where I spent a number of years doing linguistic work, there's a range, 700 plus people groups. There are some groups that speak Indonesian as their primary language that come from the more populated parts of the country, other groups that are minority religious groups, minority language groups, minority cultural groups. And even though both of those groups may come to Australia from Indonesia, their experience within their own country was very, very different. And so some of those things, like your assumptions about being assertive, your assumptions about whether the legal system will operate to your advantage or not to your advantage, whether you can trust police, whether you can trust governments, whether you can trust government authority, those types of things are likely to be very much influenced by whether somebody has come from a dominant group or a non-dominant group in their own home country or country of origin. And so you may need to be actually asking the question respectfully, politely, but finding out, has somebody come from a position of dominance in their background, their home country, versus come from a people group that was non-dominant. And the way that you would need to interact with those two different groups or different people will be different, even though they've both come from the same country. So it's not enough just to say, well, I'm working with people who speak English as a second language, so this is my strategy. There are very, very different experiences in terms of that, of interactions with legal systems and interactions with authority, depending on their own level of dominance and which group they came from their home country. So we need to do a little bit more thinking and investigation at that level. So here's a quote that I'll give you from Michael Walsh, who's quoting another linguist. So he's talking about cross-cultural interaction. He says, when a rich point occurs, an ethnographer learns that his or her assumptions about how the world works, usually implicit and out of awareness, are inadequate to understand something that happened. A gap, a distance between two worlds has just surfaced in the details of human activity. Rich points, the words and actions that signal those gaps, are the unit of data for ethnographers. For it is this distance between two worlds of experience that is exactly the problem that ethnographic research is designed to locate and resolve. The rich point you assume isn't their problem, it's your problem. The rich point doesn't mean that they're irrational or disorganized. It means that you're not yet competent to understand it. There is, you assume, a point of view, a way of thinking and acting, a context for the action in terms of which the rich point makes sense. So, I mean, if we had a little bit more time from a participatory point of view, I'd love to sort of, hear from you what things jump out at you from this quote. From my point of view, there's a few things that I really like about how this has been framed or discussed. One is just calling it a rich point. When something goes wrong, when we have a communication breakdown or an instance where cross-culturally we don't understand why people are doing something, we don't understand why people are responding in a certain way, we don't understand why people are saying something, people are telling us a story, we have no idea why they're telling us that story. That's the rich point, because that's where we start to understand the gap between the two worldviews. And so that's actually, we shouldn't see that as a point of frustration. We should actually consider ourselves very fortunate to be in a situation where we have an opportunity to understand the gap and understand the differences in worldview. The next part of what Agar says here that I really like is basically, when you have those points that might on the surface appear as points of tension, we don't understand, why is this person doing it, why did they react like that, all of those types of things, we need to take that view that it's not their problem, it's my problem. Number one, we're the professionals, we're the ones who are going into people's spaces, we're the ones who are supposed to be experts and competent at community education. And we don't ever blame participants for when things go wrong. But even more fundamentally, it's reminding ourselves that just because it doesn't make sense to me, it doesn't mean it doesn't make sense. There is a system, there is a framework, there is a logic, there is a way of viewing these things that makes that response, that makes that story, that makes that question, that makes that resistance completely logical and completely understandable. The issue is just that me as the outsider, I'm not yet competent to understand what that system is. And so I find myself doing this a lot as a very practical strategy, is actually reminding myself when somebody's talking and I'm going, no, don't know why you're telling me this, don't know what the relevance is, or, you know, running out of time, I really need to move on. Or, you know, people are responding in ways that I might find irritating, I might find confusing, to actively remind myself and say, no, there's a framework that makes sense of this. There's a framework in which what this person is doing is completely natural, completely normal, completely acceptable. It's just that I don't yet understand that framework. So don't respond on the assumption that what they're doing is irrational or nonsensical. So it's very much kind of an internal ethical perspective, but it's a really key starting point from an attitude to go, no, there is a framework here. It's just me who doesn't understand that framework. So some of the things we need to be careful of, and these are things that I see a lot of people doing in intercultural, cross-cultural education, is, well, the biggest problem is when people just ignore it and they think that you can just roll out the same materials, the same programs, do the same type of education processes with people who come from a dominant cultural English-speaking background, and you can just transfer that to people who come from a completely different worldview, completely different set of experiences. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is then when people start to go, okay, well, there is a difference in culture, difference in worldview, then the trap is to problematize that and go, well, the reason they don't understand is because they think like this, or the reason is because they don't understand this concept, or it's because they can't accept this. And so you've created a picture where the problem is something about the other culture or the other worldview. Now, again, that goes back to that quote from Freire, goes back to what I was mentioning about earlier, which is when you then allow that miscommunication, when you allow those points of tension, those points of lack of understanding to feed back into an assertion that the problem lies with them, it's something about their worldview, something about their way of thinking, well, you are actually feeding back into that cycle of the dominant culture, reminding, reinforcing that actually our way of doing things is normal. Our perspectives on things are the more objective things. And that's the privilege that those of us who come from dominant cultural, dominant linguistic positions have, is we get to pretend like our ways of doing and thinking are normal. And where there's a point of tension, it's because there's something lacking or something divergent. And that's really damaging. That really shuts down relationships. That's really reinforcing all of those negative stereotypes that a lot of non-dominant cultures and people groups have to live with on a day-to-day basis. So once you become aware of the gap between two cultures, it's really important to never allow yourself to fall into that trap of problematizing and saying, well, the reason there's this problem is because their culture does it like that, or there's a gap or whatever in their way of thinking and their worldview or their culture. So if we go back to our model, which is good CLE is really about building a bridge between the two worldviews, between the two systems. The next thing that I would say is that to do it well, actually the bridge needs to be built from the non-dominant system back into the dominant system. So it's not about me building a bridge going, oh, I'm going to try and find something in your culture that will help you understand this thing that I'm teaching you about, or I'm going to work out and figure out your culture. It's actually about going, how does that bridge come from your system, your perspectives, and then we find out how your perspectives match up or interact with the dominant culture legal system, dominant culture legal assumptions and understanding. And there's a few reasons why I think this approach is important. One, again, is the power imbalance issue, which is it forces us to work in partnership with people as colleagues, as co-educators, as peers from the non-dominant cultural system, because actually most of the heavy legwork is going to be done by people who we're working with from that non-dominant culture system. We're reliant on them, we're completely dependent on them to help us build the bridge back into the dominant culture. It's also, I think, very respectful to allow the non-dominant perspective to be presented first, rather than going, well, here's the real story. This is how the law works. And this is what will send you to jail. This is how democracy works. This is how human rights work. Okay, now is there anything that's different between the objective reality that I've just presented to you and something that might be different in your culture? Again, that so easily shifts back into that dominant, non-dominant perspective where you're saying the way we do things in the dominant legal system is the normal. This is the thing. You're just going to have to live with it. Doesn't matter if you like it. Doesn't matter if you don't like it. This is the way it is because this legal system has all of the power. Instead, start with, well, what are your perspectives? What are your stories? And then you build the bridge back into it. So there's a few, I guess, subtle traps that we can fall into that will cause that offense, that will cause the relationships to break down. I'll give you one. I mean, this is a very, very low level example at even just at sentence level, but.
I have a little point of tension.
Sorry, John, go on.
I have a point of tension, right? And we're running out of time. So I'm wondering how we build a bridge from your sense of time to
my sense of time to, yeah. Well, I'm on Northern Territory time, which is the best time in the world, in the sense that we generally just ignore it. But all right, I'll wrap up in about 5 minutes. Does that work with Cairns time? Is 5 minutes good, John?
Perfect.
All right, good. So the one example that I was going to give was just, and this was some work I was doing with land councils, and they had a script that they were using for community meetings. Community meetings were not going particularly well, so they were wanting me to kind of take a look at what they were doing. Now, multiple issues, but one of the things that was fairly obvious was the very first sentence that they were saying was Aboriginal land comes from the Land Rights Act 1976. Now, that's a really strong example of trying to build a bridge from the dominant system and basically saying our system is the objective reality. I mean, what traditional owner would not be offended by the statement that it was the whitefellas law that created their land and gave them their land? Aboriginal land has always existed. The only question is the what extent to which it's been recognised by the dominant culture system. So you have all of these little sentences, little things that are causing offence, that are causing breakdowns in relationships, causing breakdowns in trust. All right, so the short version there is basically you really need to spend a lot of time. The bigger the gap, the bigger the cross-cultural gap, the bigger the gap in terms of worldview and experience, the more time you need to spend in actually hearing the participants' understanding, hearing the participants' stories first, finding out what the metaphors and the narratives and the concepts that they already have as your starting point. And that's where the real work exists, in actually you learning and you understanding. And of course, once that happens well, the bridge back into the mainstream legal system often becomes really, really effective because you've built the bridge from the right foundation and you've made those concepts and those links between stories and narratives that already exist, and the meaning is already clear. You're moving from what people know into what they don't know. Always go from the known to the unknown. So the last kind of framework, I suppose, that I would leave you with is these are what I would say are, the most basic essential ingredients. Now, the communication side of things is its own discussion in terms of, words and grammatical structures and narrative patterns and questioning patterns. And those are things that I've talked, I think, with a number of you on different occasions, that we could easily spend just a day on its own covering how you do good cross-cultural communication at that sentence and paragraph level. But what I want to focus on much more today is the trust in the relationship. Because even if you have good communication, but you don't have that trust and you don't have that time, then that two different perceptions is going to kick in. The way that we receive information from somebody that we trust is very, very different than the way that we receive information from a stranger. Even if they literally both said the same thing, we're going to hear it in different ways. We're going to retain it in different ways. We're going to respond to it in different ways. So I keep wanting to give examples, but that's NT time. So a couple of the things just from that trust and time. I'll start with the time. But again, remembering that often your best interaction is before and after, whether it's a session or a community meeting or whatever it is, don't just show up 5 minutes beforehand, rock up, do your 2-hour session, and then drive out 5 minutes later. Actually, all of the really important time is often the time before and after. So give yourself as much possible time before and after as you can, because that's also, not only is that where the relationships are built and the trust is built, that's also where you'll get some of the real questions coming up that people are often embarrassed, ashamed, not feeling comfortable to ask in a bigger group setting. Pre-visits, pre-conversations, really, really crucial. I'll just, give an example of some recent work that we were doing for Northern Territory Government around local decision-making policy. And, they had asked us to do some community workshops, consultations about differences in governance styles between traditional Aboriginal governance and Western governance approaches. And, the budget was basically, they wanted us to go and facilitate some meetings between government and senior traditional owners and young leaders. And so we looked at that and we were like, yeah, thanks, but no thanks. But, we saw that the purpose and the intention was important, but the design was very flawed. So a few of the things that we did, we went out in advance, had a completely separate trip before any of the government people got there, just to sit down and talk with people, just to, spend a couple of days making sure that people were knew us, that we were touching base again, that we were having multiple pre-discussions about what these meetings were going to be in the future, hearing people's concerns so that we had a really good foundation, both relationally and we already knew some of the bigger issues that were likely to arise. The next thing we did was we said, well, actually, we're going to do 3 days of meetings or discussions without government present, because having, the government present really skews that dominant, non-dominant side of things. And this is not about government telling people what they need to know. This is about people actually coming up with their own solutions and their own ideas. We said those 3 days of discussions are Yolngu Mata only, so people's first language. So we had a quite strict approach to not having anything presented in English. We also had done a whole bunch of first language radio plays on some of the key concepts that we knew would come up. So people were hearing stuff in first language several weeks in the lead up. And then when we finally let the 3 levels of government come into that space on the 4th day, we also set it up so that the first half of the day was Yolngu leaders reflecting back to government what they had been talking about, so that they had the first voice, they had the starting point of putting their perspective first, rather than government starting with the government's reality. So I think when you yeah, all right, no worries. So time, and we'll pull up stumps there to use a bad culturally specific analogy. Any questions or comments?
What we're going to do is we're going to apply some of the things using practical activities around the tables. I'm going to use my control the microphone to, at the moment, not allow questions. But be sure that this is an ongoing conversation. And we'll have numerous feedback loops at times when we can know, people can talk to you, they know where you are, they've got your number, and they're ringing you often. But thank you, Ben. Let's give him a big round of applause and appreciate. That's the story to approximately.
Thank you, everyone. Hope the rest of your time as well.
Thanks,
Mark, sorry, I missed that, John, but I assume it was very relevant and witty and well presented.
Yeah. Thanks.
Oh, all right. Thanks, everyone.
Keeping with so many things that Ben said, I'm reminded that something really important that we need to do is just take some time to process all the stuff that's happening so far. So the next thing on the program is a choice of two things.